Specific emotions tend to drive specific behavior. And so even as believers, when we think about being called to live in certain ways, if we're going to try to live a certain way, but we don't have any ability to identify and regulate emotions, that's going to make that journey very, very difficult.
Welcome, everyone, to Breaking Bread, the podcast brought to you by Apostolic Christian Counseling and Family Services. Amber Miller and Brian Sutter are with me today. Welcome to both of you.
Thanks.
Yeah, good to be here.
The topic today is emotional intelligence. Sometimes that goes by EQ, or the emotional quotient. For any out there who doesn't know what we're talking about, I think it would serve us well to have a definition, start to cage this term, tell us what it is.
Yeah, maybe just as a starting point, just to think of emotional intelligence as being able to understand what emotions are at a high level, as well as internally to be able to identify, label your own emotions, be aware of other people's emotions, and then being able to navigate those well.
And so with that too, the reason that we want to encourage people to do that and why it's important to do that is just because our emotions lead to behaviors. And if we're not careful, those lead to behaviors that are not godly.
Okay, so you've just, Amber, with that made a connection here, the effect that emotions have. There's a cause and effect, and our behaviors often stem from our emotions. Can I say feelings? Are feelings and emotions, are they, I'm sure there's some differences to tease out, but is that?
Yeah, I think you can use those pretty interchangeably. Same thing, yeah.
But to see that we're a product of the way that we feel and the emotions that we're having, and it's probably impacted by other people's emotions. And so that's really what you're saying there, Brian, is to kind of this an awareness of my own and the awareness of another person's, and then somewhat the awareness of how these two are going to interact now.
Yeah.
Is that part of what?
Absolutely, yeah. And I think, too, it's an area of life where it's easy to fall into, one of two ditches. One being to overvalue emotions and see them in such a place that they kind of rule and reign over everything. But then also the other ditch can be to just
To minimize.
Yeah, to minimize, to say that the goal is really to get rid of emotions and that sort of a thing. And neither of those are good places. They're important to validate, they're important to be there, but they're certainly not to be in charge.
Well, let's start maybe by a little bit of creation. Where do emotions come from? I would say God has emotions. Do we have that in Scripture?
Well, I mean, I think you certainly see God being a relational being, and in that, even in his interaction with Adam and Eve in the garden and the different things that he does, it would seem to indicate that him being the originator and creating us in his image, that would seem to portray this idea that God has emotions, cares about emotions, and there's emotions throughout the Scriptures all over the place.
No, and it is really true. When you look at Scripture, you have a whole book, Lamentations. It's all about sadness and going through that. And you think of just all the Psalms too, and the ups and downs that King David had. And so you see, again, just a person's emotional experience throughout Scripture.
Even in one psalm, you can have David go from the lowest of troughs to what would seem the highest of mountaintops.
Yeah. And in capturing that, I think it's one of the reasons why so many people, kind of gravitate towards the Psalms and really identify with the Psalms because
they're real.
They're very real, and they don't shy away from really intense, hard, open expression of emotion.
Right. So if we're saying that that's part of our design, and as you said there, Brian, that somehow it comes out of God's likeness in whatever way that is, that might be too deep for us to understand, but in some ways it comes out of our likeness to him, and so then it might serve some purposes. What are some of the purposes then emotions play?
Specific emotions tend to drive specific behavior. And so even as believers, when we think about being called to live in certain ways, if we're going to try to live a certain way, but we don't have any ability to identify and regulate emotions, that's going to make that journey very, very difficult.
To behave against the emotion is a difficult thing.
Exactly.
Right. Amber, were you ever told by your parents to forgive your brother or sister before your emotions were there?
Maybe.
Probably not. Yeah. No, Brian, I'm going to turn to you.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me tell you, both of you, that I so know what that's like, right?
Yeah, right.
Which basically, we're saying behave this way, and to your point,
right,
if the emotions aren't there, it makes even that activity. Now, I'm not saying that my forgiveness is locked up in my emotions. I'm just saying that it's a difficult exercise.
Right. And it's that place where with emotion comes action, but also an important part of emotion that it informs us. It informs us of kind of maybe what's going on internally, but also what might be going on for somebody else based on their body cues or body language as well as for our own. And that when we see somebody hurting, like, oh, I might not realize it, but maybe I've hurt them and I need to engage the behavior of forgiveness when I don't necessarily feel that.
And without emotion, you can't empathize with someone. I can't put myself in someone else's shoes. I think it's pretty natural for us to just have these, I guess, this awareness that, hey, someone's crying. What does that mean to us? And I think each of us would be able to say, like, what that means. Most people would. If you see someone that's laughing or smiling, again, we connect with that. And so it's really being able to understand the emotion of someone else, put ourselves in their place.
Is this a discipline whereby we can become more empathetic, more aware of?
I think
You're
so.
saying yes.
I think so, very much.
What would some of that look like?
We had to go through some of that training, I know, just in our education. I mean, learning, again, what are body cues and how do you pick those things up? And again, what are responses, too, to some emotional experiences that people have. And so, again, I'm not saying that everybody needs to be a counselor to do that, but over time, if you are interested in relationships and desire to grow in those, I think you prioritize that and you look for ways to engage with others. And sometimes it is over years of interaction that you learn that is something I say in this situation, or this is a circumstance where I'm silent and I just listen.
So it comes a lot just through being with people. Right? If you're cognizant of these interactions that you're having, right? Basically, as a counselor, you've had a great deal of interactions with people on these deep levels, and that engenders an empathy in a sense, an awareness of the way people feel.
In my mind, one of the key points there is to be able to be in tune with your own emotions, like to know when you're feeling sad and to be able to connect with that. Whereas I think for a lot of us, that, we try to distance ourselves from emotions or minimize them, that we can give emotions a bad rap and therefore see them as unnecessary or something to get rid of. But if we can connect with our own emotions and we know what it's like to be sad ourselves, and then we're picking up from somebody else, oh, it looks like they might be sad, that is going to give us cues on how to connect with their sadness when we've already known how to connect with our own.
Yeah. So you've already mentioned that one of the ditches is that we minimize emotions.
Yeah.
So you're kind of pulling us out of that ditch and saying, hey, no, emotions mean something, and this person is experiencing something that's not too distant from maybe what you've experienced. To connect with that.
Yeah, exactly. And in that just gives us that opportunity, I think, to build that community that we desire, and I think the scriptures certainly support, but without some emotional awareness and ability then to connect with somebody else who's hurting, that makes that very difficult to cultivate that kind of a culture.
And with that minimization, a lot of times that I see someone that's just trying to push away anything that's negative, and so they always want to stay in the positive. And so some people may think, well, I get emotion, but I would also just ask a person to kind of look at that. And are you okay sitting in the hard emotion too? Like, can you express emotion, and then can you be okay with anger, with sadness, and just wrestling through some of those things instead of just, okay, I feel it, it's gone, I'm done.
In that moment, you have to recognize that anger and sadness have a place and have a healthy place.
Right. Yeah, they're cues in some way.
Yeah. In counseling, one of the old sayings that's been around for a long time is, if you can name it, then you can tame it. So if you can name the feeling and you can connect with it, then that's going to give you the ability over time to be able to deal with it and work through it. But yeah, just having language around emotion is a big key, and I think can allow us to step into some of those vulnerable interactions and relationships with people, whereas, it's pretty easy at this point, I think, just to kind of gravitate, talking about the things that are pretty high level, which isn't always wrong, but we need those deeper connections.
It's not wrong, but when we're avoiding
Right.
what needs to be said or what needs to be worked through, that's where it's wrong.
And to be able to do that, it's going to take some emotional intelligence to understand your own emotions and be able to sit with other people's emotions, and especially those hard emotions that are uncomfortable.
Let's go to the other ditch. Emotions are too much in the driver's seat. Okay, paint that scenario.
In my mind, that's kind of where culture is in general right now, and it says, do what you feel, you are what you feel, and just kind of to be authentic means that you let emotions tell you what is real and you follow that with passion. And that sounds really good, it sounds really exciting, but it's pretty dangerous and doesn't end very well.
Yeah, I think that is a big myth right now of just, I can't help how I feel. And so people just really dive into their emotion. And like we're saying, it's important to know that and know where you're at emotionally. But that's not necessarily helpful to sit in for days or to sit there and all of a sudden that's driving everything you're doing or not doing, just strictly based on what you're feeling at that moment.
To live in a way that's consistent with the Scriptures, in a way that is wise, we need, like the high functioning part of our brain, our frontal cortex, which is the thinking part of the brain, that needs to really be engaged. And if we just let the emotion run, then that is going to make it difficult for the Scriptures to be the thing that actually end up dictating our behavior. That connection there that says if we're not thinking in a way that's in line with the Scriptures, it's just emotion, we're going to all live like 2-year-olds, and that's not a good place to be.
Right. So there's a connection here between thought and emotion and behavior. So put all those together then.
I guess going off of what Brian said too is that a lot of times I'll explain it as emotions on one side and then logic is on the other. And when you mix those together, you get wisdom. And so even thinking through, people will maybe tend toward one way of thinking, people will tend toward logic, or people will tend to be more driven by emotion. But that doesn't mean we can just reject the other. We have to learn how to blend that into our thinking so that we can move toward wisdom.
And I think, too, when I read the Apostle Paul, I think he's a pretty strong logic kind of a person, but also I see him like he expresses really strong love and care and compassion towards people. And I just love that mix of him. Like he is a very strong thinker, but also cares deeply about people. And that mix, I think, drives him, obviously the Spirit working in him, then to live and behave in a way that's consistent with, the model of Christ.
You almost get a sense that his strong thinking, his strong thoughts, right? Biblical, God-oriented thoughts gave rise to very appropriate feeling. Right? We feel very appropriately about the lost, for example, when we're thinking accurately about the lost. When we're thinking appropriately about our own sin, then we feel appropriately about our own sin, right?
Another myth that we'll hear quite often or we see people wrestle with is that emotions are bad. And so again, I think that's where you see more of that shoving or that stuffing, because people don't know what to do with those. And again, if you don't know what to do with your anger, you don't know what to do with your fear or your sadness, like that is a really scary place to be.
I mean, I think there is an association between weakness, right, and emotion. A weak person will not be able,
Right.
Don't cry, for example.
Right, yeah. And I think that's another, very common myth that we hear too, that if I were just stronger or whatever, then I wouldn't feel this way, or I wouldn't experience it this way. And a lot of times that's not the case at all. It's just that emotion is going to come with things of life, and sometimes that's sadness, sometimes that's anger, sometimes that's excitement, and that's just part of the package.
Yes.
Another one that comes to mind too is just that I'll always feel this way. And so again, sitting in that hard emotion and not really seeing the light at the end of the tunnel with that. And so all of a sudden you get this discouragement that sets on and all sorts of other negative emotions that just, it's almost like they start to multiply.
Yeah, it's hard for a profoundly sad person to view themselves not sad anymore.
Right.
And that's what you're saying.
Yeah, sometimes it becomes like a person's identity.
Yeah.
And that's my personality, or this is just who I am. And
maybe we should add as a resource is Winnie the Pooh. That would probably some good reading there, right?
Yeah,
Eeyore and
classic
Tigger,
example.
Piglet. There's a lot to learn.
Oh my. Yes, there is.
Okay, how about our own bodies? Our bodies, the physiology. Did I say that right? Physiology, is that right? Makes a difference. Hormones makes a difference.
Yeah.
That all weighs in, and that's got to be a part of our regulation lens, right?
Oh, yeah. And I think our body, again, can help us signify what we're feeling. Like even just over the weekend, there were certainly times, it was an intense weekend, like where I just have a pretty strong pain in my chest. And for me to be able to recognize, oh, my chest hurts, you know what? I think I'm feeling pretty anxious and I need to go for a walk, or I need to take some deep breaths, or I need to talk to somebody. So yeah, your body is kind of signifying, oh, something's going on here. And if we can get aware of that and aware of it earlier, is going to help you then process through it.
Yeah.
An illustration that I love to use with people is like a car dashboard. And a lot of times you see like little indicator lights that come on, and you know what to do with that. You know what to do if you see your gas light come on in your car. You better go fill up with gas. But a lot of times when people see like little emotion lights go on in their brain, they don't know what to do with that. Okay, I feel lonely. Well, what's 9 out of 10's people response when they feel lonely? They probably isolate themselves more, unfortunately, instead of addressing that need, that little indicator light that's gone off. And the right way to deal with that would be, hey, I'm lonely. I need to go seek out some people. I need to go be with people for a while.
Yeah.
And I think, too, even in counseling, that sometimes is a starting point that we would have somebody start with of, hey, why don't you go checked out medically and, run some blood tests, or just make sure that there's not something, physically going on that's maybe, the driver here. I think that certainly would make a lot of sense.
Yeah, there's no question that we have stereotypes for a reason. And you think about like puberty and teenage girls and stuff. And there's a reason like why they're all over the place emotionally. Menopause. I mean, just all sorts of changes. Pregnancy, for crying out loud. And a lot of times people joke about those things, but it's very real. And all of a sudden people are feeling things in whole new intensities that they've never felt before. And they're not sure what's going on.
To be prudent in those times of life to say, wait a minute here.
Oh, yeah.
How much is my own chemistry and how much is...
It just reminds me, too, that God having created us all a bit different, and one of the visuals that I have is that I kind of see God, there's different knobs, and some people, he turns the emotional knob up, and they feel emotion really intensely, and then it maybe shows up in their body more so, and therefore, like the scriptures tell us, it's not wise to compare ourselves among ourselves, because my experience of sadness is going to be felt very different than somebody else's. And that's, I think, that knob that God set. And I need to know mine and respect somebody else's. And that if I walk through it this way and they walk through it that way, that we can join each other rather than figure out who's right, if that makes sense.
Because I do think there's a very much comparative, as you mentioned it.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I've been through that, and it didn't have that same effect. I didn't feel that way, so yours must be unwarranted.
Yes, exactly. And then it kind of throws it right back into some of those myths of, well, maybe I shouldn't feel this way, or what am I doing wrong?
Yeah.
And we want to think about those things and think, what can I do differently? But a lot of times it just is.
Yeah. I'm going to cut in on our conversation regarding emotional regulation right here and bring this episode of Breaking Bread to a close. But more of the conversation still remains, and we look forward to airing that the next time. And when we do, we're going to zero in on skill set. What does it look like to apply some of what we've learned? So we look forward to that. Thanks, listeners, for being with us.